Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining Clearer Than Truth. Our guest today is Scott Kennedy. Scott is one of Washington's most respected voices on Chinese economic policy, a leading expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he serves as a senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics. Today, we'll talk about the direction of China's economy, how its approach to trade, international policy, and critical minerals is shaping the global system, and what to expect from the upcoming 15th five-year plan. We'll also look ahead to how Beijing's thinking might influence the next phase of international economic governance. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
It's a real pleasure. We should just jump right into it. I mean, we're both fascinated, I think, by your kind of recent analysis of China's domestic economy and, where it stands in this kind of world of economic confrontation. And so I wonder if you could just provide for our readers a little bit of a recap of your concept of involution and how it plays into the kind of contemporary discussion.
Sure. Well, I think, again, it's great to be with both of you. My sense of China's economy overall is I call it a slow tech dragon because it's complex, but I think this sums things up for me. On the one hand, everybody knows China is doing amazing things in tech, right? It's got a monster electric vehicle industry, battery industry. They produce and consume over half of the world's electric vehicles, dominate in battery technology, and they are exporting and investing around the world. You can see the same in robotics, in biopharma, in a bunch of different industries. And going to China, visiting factories, you get to see all of this up close. At the same time, China has a bunch of economic problems, both cyclical and structural, things that are just they're managing right now, as well as sort of long-term problems. They have a bunch of debt, a huge amount of debt that they've built up, partly because their growth model has been based on infrastructure and real estate. And that only can get you so far. You can only build so many kilometers of high-speed rail and highways and apartment buildings before you run out of demand. And they've long gone past that. Their population is aging. They have a variety of other challenges that they're trying to deal with. And so currently, in the years after the pandemic, they pressed on the accelerator to get more output of infrastructure and manufactured goods, and they got all that. And then they pressed on the accelerator for consumption, and nothing happened. Chinese consumption is just nowhere near bounced back to where it needs to be. Chinese are anxious about the pandemic. They're worried about war with the United States. They're anxious about China's domestic political environment, the healthcare system, and other types of social services that make up the safety net are weak. So they've been holding on to their money this is the rainy day. And that gap between what they produce and consumption is excess capacity. It's wasted production. And in China, it has gotten this label involution. That is excess stuff sitting around where they can try and sell some of it on the global market, but there's just excess capacity. And so there's deflation in China that is hurting jobs, that is hurting the financial system. And so you've got both of these things, a supercharged high-tech juggernaut and a very slow economy with excess capacity described in China as involution, both existing at the exact same time. They are both the product of the exact same system. They are not differences or two alternative Chinas. They are part of the one China that has these two different elements to it.
Right. I'm fascinated by that analysis, in part because I was, in the administration for the first 4 months as one of the managers of the tariff policy. And I would be asked by my colleagues, George, why is it you think that prices are not going to rise if we, tariff goods coming out of China? And the way that I put it was, basically in two ways. First of all, it's a command economy that through its last 5-year plan has really deployed capital to produce, more low value, low tech goods. And so once you've charted out that path, you'll accept kind of less and less profit on each unit, and you'll continue producing. But also, I tried to argue, just kind of in a caricaturized way about Lenin's theory of imperialism, right? That when you have this excess capital sloshing around in your economy, it can, unless you have a place to send goods, you have a real problem, right? It can create this kind of social dislocation. It can create anger and anxiety in society. Do you think those points have any kind of merit here in terms of when we go from China's economy, its domestic context, to the international stage? Why the tariff policy might produce a different outcome than we expect, or is that the wrong set of interpretive steps to take?
I understand the logic behind the idea for the tariffs and why one could make a reasonable case that they wouldn't translate into inordinately higher prices for American consumers when they go to Walmart or import things in other places. I would say we're just very early in the game, right? We're just a few months in to this strategy, and we'll have to see at some point what this translates into in terms of prices. I would say in terms of China's economy, it's not a free market by any means, right? But it's not 1960s state socialism where planners are pulling all the levers and everyone is reacting to those levers. The way 5-year plans are made is very different than they were made before. China next week will come out with an outline of its next 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan. And the domestic economy is highly competitive. You have several hundred EV makers competing with each other, and that's a giant problem. So it's got elements of both markets and extensive government intervention like we don't have here in the U.S. or almost any place else. And it's that combination of highly competitive markets and extensive government and intervention pulling people into priority industries that has generated this problem. And this occurs every few years. Every few years, China will have this buildup of excess capacity. And then eventually it gets absorbed into the economy. It gets exported or it just gets written off. And then they consolidate and then they do it again. So this is probably the 4th or 5th time over the last 30 years that I've been following China's economy that they've had this. In terms of what it means for China's economy and can they get through this? Does the tariffs put them in a really difficult bind? Certainly, this is not what they would prefer. Right now, the U.S. tariffs on China cumulatively are about 55%. You take Trump 1.0 tariffs, Biden era tariffs, the 20% fentanyl tariffs, the others, and you get to roughly 55%. They wouldn't like that, but they have found a way to absorb some of those costs, as you mentioned, have the importers from the U.S. absorb some of those costs and then pass some on to consumers. So the overall price increase on in the stores aren't super high yet. So we'll see. I think that one of those issues is that exports have not been a key driver of Chinese growth since 2008. The last couple of years, they've been more important because the domestic economy has slowed down post-pandemic. But from 2010 to 2023, exports were basically irrelevant to growth. It was basically this domestic investment story. And China's economy has continued to grow as relative to its international trade. So our market is still extremely important, and we can and by denying access through higher tariffs and other policies, puts a lot of pressure on China, but it doesn't squeeze them with a death grip that it would have, say, 15 years ago. And the other part of this is that other countries are not aligning with the U.S. with the same kind of tariffs on China. And so their exports to the U.S. have dropped by 20% this year, but they've increased more than 20% to Europe, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. So that has put a crimp in some businesses in China, but it hasn't overall slowed down Chinese growth. And I think the third thing would be is that the Chinese leadership's tolerance for pain is pretty darn high. They are not going to be looking at their stock market to decide whether they need to reach a deal with us or re-escalate. It's run by the Communist Party. They don't have a political opposition. They could. Xi Jinping is large and in charge, and so they're willing. If we want to throw down with them and go into the back alley and do arm wrestling match, which is what we're doing right now, it's a fair fight. Both sides have leverage. Both sides have power, and we will get something out of this, but we probably won't get all the things that we want. It probably won't translate into a massive increase in American manufacturing or the elimination of our global trade deficit or things like that. But it's certainly gotten the world's attention and China's attention, and that's why we're chatting about it.
Well, I want to sort of dive into how Belt and Road plays into this. In 2013, they famously wanted to pursue more trade with Latin American countries, South American countries, and other places in the world. Is their economy sort of protected a bit by having these new trade relationships?
For those who are listening who may have heard of the Belt and Road once or twice in their life, which is probably more than you need to hear about it for the average person. The Chinese have, primarily been a recipient of others moving their manufacturing to China, and then the Chinese figuring out how to more efficiently ramp up assembly, manufacturing, et cetera. And so the Chinese have been moving up the value-added chain, right? At the same time, that means as they've done so, labor costs in China have gotten incrementally higher over the years. And, China may want to, for some folks in China would like to keep the entire value chain inside China. But China's comparative advantage has been shifting, right? And so so that is one reason they have said, well, let's move some of the production that we've had here. Let's invest in other countries where labor costs are cheaper, give us access to those markets. There's also sort of diplomatic benefits by spreading the wealth, improving China's diplomatic standing with other countries, helps them avoid being isolated. So this all came together in 2013 in what Xi Jinping and the Chinese leaders called the Belt and Road Project. Actually, it was originally an idea within both the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Foreign Affairs for different reasons. And over the years, the Belt and Road has become a Christmas tree on which many different ministries and local governments hang their own ornaments about what they think it ought to be. And so the Chinese have given foreign aid. They have moved companies abroad, private companies, state-owned companies around the world to create these connections between China's economy and others in Asia and as far away as Brazil and Argentina. It takes a goddamn long time to get from China to Brazil. It's like a 2-day trip. So, I mean, it's really, really far. So, and in any case, the Belt and Road is, I think, probably overemphasized these days because beginning in 2017 and 18, when China started having its own financial problems, it slowed down its giving of foreign aid and these investments because they needed that money at home to cover their debts domestically. So the project still exists. It's written into the Chinese constitution. It's written into these 5-year plans, but it's not as centrally relevant as it used to be. But Chinese investment around the world, we got to take that really frickin' seriously. So we're just about to come out with a report from my program on Chinese investments in EVs and batteries around the planet, and it is fundamentally changing the auto sector everywhere except in the United States, where other companies in those regions are building supply chains that intersect with China. So, is that Belt and Road? I don't know, but it is China Inc. going global, and that is a very real phenomena and something that we need to better understand.
I want to take one more before George. I want to look even further back before 2013. President Obama famously wanted to pivot to Asia. He wanted to pursue TPP and other trade deals. He didn't necessarily view China as a forever adversary. Trump does, obviously pulled us out of TPP and has taken a dramatically different approach to global trade and dealing with China and other Asian countries. Where would China be today economically had the U.S. stuck with their trade policies in the region, and sort of if the U.S. would have stuck with a more friendly willingness to cooperate as opposed to where they are today?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to say, and I do think that by the later years of the Obama administration, they had also grown frustrated with China. That the commitments they made when they joined the WTO in 2001, they were not meeting. And in fact, the Chinese have said, well, we've got this different economic model. We're going to do things our way. Xi Jinping has turbo boosted that, which basically means all that stuff that we promised you, forget all that. You want to sue us? We got plenty of lawyers. We'll slow things down there. Then try to even if you win cases, try and implement them. So I think even by the late Obama administration, they had become frustrated. And we're looking for strategies as, how do we get the Chinese to comply and do business with us and the rest of the world on fairer terms? And their solution at that time was, let's work with a new organization that the Chinese are not in. We'll enter it ourselves. We'll have the rest of the world enter it. We'll have the Chinese on the outside looking in. And then to get into this new organization, they'll have to make a whole new series of reforms. That was the idea behind the U.S. joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was really created by New Zealand and Japan a decade before. And so we got the U.S., it took a long time to negotiate. And the U.S. finally entered in 2016. And of course, Hillary Clinton lost the election against Trump. She really did lose. And so, but she was skeptical about TPP. So was obvious President Trump pulled us out. And so we decided we're not going to try that. We're not going to use this new WTO-like organizational entry mechanism to force the Chinese to reform again. So instead, the Trump administration decided we'll use tariffs. We will raise tariffs on China and force them to yell uncle to reform their economy if they want to. And so in early 2020, we ended up negotiating what was called the Phase 1 trade deal, where the Chinese made commitments to buy 200 billion additional American goods, a variety of reforms. And then a week later, we got the pandemic. So basically, forget that deal. Then the Biden administration came in and they were like, we don't think the Chinese actually, no matter whether we ask them politely, put them on the outside of agreement and say you got to do stuff to get in, or put tariffs on them, we don't think that they're going to change. We think so. The Biden administration said instead, we're not going to negotiate with the Chinese and we're not going to ask them for anything. Instead, we're just going to work on America and our allies. So CHIPS and Science Act, other industrial policy measures to invest at home, greater coordination with allies, de-risking with China, so more controls on the Chinese. And with the assumption that would never get the Chinese to adapt. And then the Trump administration, as we were talking before, Trump 2.0, it's been all about tariffs to try and force the Chinese. I think if we had stuck with the original strategy on TPP, put them on the outside looking in, I think we would have gotten incrementally better Chinese policies than we had, because those were some significant demands that we would have had. I think we would have probably, things would have improved marginally. They wouldn't have been fun. China wouldn't have gone back to reform and opening and the path to a free market. I think the area where things would have been the biggest difference is I don't think we would have had the escalatory spiral that we've had on China really pursuing a strategy of technology self-reliance and de-Americanizing their entire supply chain, especially at the pace that they've gone. I think we would have seen that goal has been there a long time. But I think we've, through our actions and the back and forth with them, we have convinced them that we will never be a reliable supplier, and that they have to be able to make all of this stuff themselves, and that it's important for their national security, and that their main and so I think that we have accelerated the pace at which China is de-Americanizing their technology supply chains and giving them the possibility that they can have sort of more global influence because they control A to Z in those supply chains. So to me, it's less about would China have tinkered with reform if we'd done something, and more that we're headed much more in a direction of what folks call decoupling in at a pace that I think that we could have better calibrated to be more in our interests, to leave us with greater global technology leadership than we're likely to have as a result of basically throwing down with the Chinese.
And I saw a stat the other day where if you look at Virginia alone in 2025, their GDP as a state has grown by 0.1% if you take out all the spending on data centers. How has China's economy sort of shifted internally to deal with the rise of artificial intelligence and data centers? And are they shifting as quickly as the US is? And are they investing as much as the US is at this point?
Oh, China's full on committed to AI as an industry, as a complement to the rest of their economy. And this goes back partly to not just Chinese industrial policy and making it a target, but China being part of global innovation chains. So becoming originally assemblers of electronics and computers, to beginning to manufacture them, collaborating with Western computer companies, IT companies, telecom companies, software firms. It's a really good book. Apple in China just came out this past year. Really explains how Apple's investments in China, their business in China, is one of the things that led to the development of China's domestic capabilities. Microsoft, huge investments in R&D. China, their science labs. They're actually the original home of most of China's AI entrepreneurs. If you go and look at them, you can trace them back to this Microsoft lab in Western Beijing. Over time, the Chinese have increasingly decided they need to step up their investments in all different kinds of automation and robotics and AI. And so the amount of money that they're pouring into this for all the different kinds of AI, whether that is improving the efficiency of manufacturing and processes, evaluating, quality control on your assembly line, apps that feed you better videos, whether it's like TikTok or large language models. They're all in on all of those things, and figuring out how all of that helps the rest of their economy, what they call AI plus. And so, and China, in addition to investing in AI directly in all of its forms, is also investing in all of that infrastructure. So the amount of electric generation capability in China, the electric grid development, data centers, the storage facilities through batteries and stuff, they will be able to support the infrastructure that goes into all of those data centers that support the cloud computing and the number crunching. Where they're really still weak is on the hardware side of the compute, right? So the Chinese still depend on foreign companies around the world, including the United States, for the semiconductors that do the number crunching for AI models, either their training or their inference. And so I think everybody now knows the company NVIDIA, which originally made these GPUs, these chips for gaming, and they figured out actually it works for a bunch of other stuff too, especially AI. So the Chinese have tried and there's to develop their own GPUs, and they have Huawei, a couple other companies do this, but they're still not as good. So as much as China has poured into all of this, they still need our chips to do this. And the U.S. has gone back and forth on what our strategy should be on how much we should deny the most advanced chips to China. And we're still debating that. We have significant restrictions, but it's not a total ban at all on China. And even when we do ban certain things, you can find folks in the Middle East who buy stuff and send it to the Chinese, or there's a data center in some other part of the world, and the Chinese rent space on that data center. So it's very, very difficult to wall them off, even on this. And so my ultimate conclusion on AI in terms of like who's ahead is depends what day of the week it is. No lead is safe in any part of this. Even if on the hardware side, we still have a significant advantage.
Yeah, I'd love to ask about that because, I think it goes back to these kind of fundamental economic differences between the American economy and China's economy, in the sense that, everyone will kind of, scratch their heads about why it is there are these huge lopsided gaps, in China's ability to advance, AI in various sectors and so on. But I think it's precisely because they have this kind of deeply, centralized planning approach to the investment in infrastructure, right? And things like AI, by their very nature, show how technology can kind of leapfrog existing infrastructure, make it irrelevant, or, given the direction of the technology, they'll, other infrastructure will be more important. I mention this because, it's often a criticism of the United States government that, we can't sort of push people in the direction of these strategic investments, but we have a great deal of faith in the market, which aggregates kind of information, and we rely on private capital much more than the Chinese. And although that is more hesitant and hodgepodge, perhaps it is more efficient than these kind of vast state interventions that can create all of these, energy centers, but then, you have a huge problem with the compute, right? And so, do you think that that's a reality, or is that, a wishful thinking, or, is this kind of command capitalism, the way that gives them a real shot at dominating in something like AI?
So China's system, which can mobilize a massive amount of capital and resources and infrastructure for priorities, really works well in technologies where the entry barrier is of medium difficulty, and where you can have incremental learning and you can have economies of scale. When you have those things, that is built perfectly for China's system. You can chuck a bunch of money and people, you can learn incrementally, and you can scale. And you can make a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit on each item that you sell. And of course, China's got 1.4 billion people, so a lot of consumers, but also they got huge government procurement system. So that works perfectly for that. Then if you add in other countries' indifference to certain markets or certain products, that opens up big opportunities for the Chinese when those two things intersect. So we've dilly-dallied on electrification of our transportation system. And the Chinese were like, oh, we can take all of the things that we can do on EVs and we can globalize. So it's the Chinese have been very disruptive in the auto sector because domestically it fits, right? You have this medium difficulty technology with electric motors and batteries. You can make a gajillion of them, make just a tiny bit. And then we've been very slow to push EVs in our markets and around the world. And so the Chinese have filled that space. And so it's been very disruptive and successful. So when all those things come together, the Chinese can leapfrog, but it's not something that happens every day. The Chinese will not necessarily come forth with a smartphone, which was a whole variety of different types of technologies from all over the place, and figure out and come out with this revolutionary technology. That doesn't fit their model. And things which are really difficult, where there are less economies of scale, they've had a much harder time. So commercial aircraft, technology requirements for the individual parts, for the systems integration, crazy high. Very little economies of scale. You only make a few hundred planes a year, and the U.S. and Europe dominate. And so it's been very, very hard for the Chinese to break into commercial aircraft. They have an alternative to Boeing and Airbus called the C919, but it was 8 years late from when it was supposed to first be delivered. And in 2024, they delivered 12 planes. This year, I think they've delivered 4, all domestic airlines, I believe. And that they can't hold a candle to us, and they're never going to be serious competitors. So there's some industries and technologies where their system is built for those, and others where it's really, really hard for them. And that variation, I don't think is going to fade away. I think it's going to continue to be there, even though, compared to where China was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it's night and day. But they do have strengths and weaknesses, and we have our own advantages as well.
I have one final question for you, and I think people hear rare earth minerals and all that stuff, and they kind of get it, but let's just unpack it a little bit. What exactly is it? Why is it so important? And why is the U.S. obsessed with it? I know it ties in with AI and chips, but I think if most people are being honest, they don't actually understand how things like cobalt play into their life and why that gives China leverage. Or all the things that make this so I can watch my baseball scores. Exactly. But no one actually knows, so I just would love to understand it better.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, I when I was a little kid, I had shovels and I dug around in my yard and with my friends, but I don't really understand rocks either. So, but nevertheless, there's a whole variety of minerals around the world that have been produced over millions of years that are valuable and go into all the different type of products that we use in our modern world. Some of them are, and these are all on your periodic table. So for those of you who studied chemistry can pull that baby out or Google it. And 17 of these are in a category called rare earth elements. And typically when you dig these things out of the ground, they are trace elements that are in other kinds of rocks. That is, you don't go just to dig out rare earths. You typically will go to dig out iron ore, which is used to make steel most often. But embedded in those iron ore rocks are also these trace minerals, rare earth elements, which we've discovered over time are really good in making things like permanent magnets, or in sonar, or lasers, or a bunch of things that are critical for commercial economies as well as our military. Right. And you don't need a ton of these things for everything. You just need a little bit, but you've got to have it. And substitutes are really difficult to break. And it turns out the U.S. used to do a lot of digging for lots of things, and then we got environmentally conscious because the health consequences of these things, the environmental consequences, were quite severe. And then the Chinese were coming along and said, you know what? We care less about that stuff, the environment and things right now, because we're at a much lower level of development, we'll dig. And so they started developing their own rare earths industry when we decided that the social environmental costs were too high. And then they also developed, on top of the digging, the processing. Like, how do you take that rock and process it in a way that it is just perfectly ready to go in materials that will go in your iPhone and your laptop and your missile? They've figured that out. And so in 2010, and so they thought, well, they'll just be the world supplier. Well, in 2010, they had to dust up with the Japanese navies, Coast Guard, and the Chinese, for the first time, were like, Japanese import a lot of these rare earths. Let's screw them. So we're gonna slow down the export of these things for a while, and coerce them to back off, to let them know that we have an ability to really hurt them. So that happened for a few months in 2010. And then the world said, oh, geez, we better start working on our own rare earth supply and processing. But that recognition that was a potential choke point only moved us so far. So China went from having, say, 100% of the rare earths that they dug out of the ground to 65% today. But China still controls 90% of processing. So the Australians, the Americans, some others have built up some processing, but there's still a lot of rocks that are dug out of the ground in other places that you send to China for processing. And you're like, well, why on earth would we not do that? So you got Obama, Trump won, Biden, all did nowhere near what they needed to do. And then the Chinese were in this technology competition. We seem to have all the cards, right? We've got the most advanced chips. We've got the bigger market. We've got the dollar. And they're looking around and like, hey, do we have anything that they really want? And they're like, oh, remember 2010? Okay, let's do that. So in April, we do Liberation Day. They do rare earths. And they have continued to tweak. And that has gotten us to back up. And so that is a challenge. So if you're trying to have a arm wrestling match with the Chinese about commanding heights of their economies and getting folks to back up, and also worried about American national security and the materials that go into it, we're in a pickle right now. We're in a real pickle. Our goal originally, I think, was, let's raise tariffs. Let's force the Chinese to back down. Let's continue to work on domestic manufacturing, reduce our dependence on the Chinese. And the Chinese have been like, oh, remember this rare earths thing and these other things that you need from us. And so now it's a real challenge. We realize we're not ready to go it alone on rocks. And so for at least the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to have to figure out how to find some kind of equilibrium with the Chinese until we break that dependence. And so that is the challenge that the U.S. and the rest of the world is in now. And so it's going to be a while for us to figure it out. And this affects everything else, right? Because you need those to go to all those different products. And so the U.S. and China are trying to, get the upper hand on each other, as well as figure out how to coexist. I don't envy the Trump administration and the president figuring out how to square the circle on these things. I don't think the Chinese economy is consistent with international norms. They don't play fair. China's foreign policy goals are inconsistent with America's, yet they've got these rocks and the processing that the world really needs. So that means that we're going to have to figure out some way to manage this thing for a while. And all I can do is wish President Trump and the folks down the street a few blocks from here good luck.
Final question, unless George has anything else. Who has more leverage right now in this economic conflict, and who will win the economic conflict? Is there winning?
Yeah. If you just did this on paper, right? If you just took the two teams, and we do this before every game on the weekend, and you just wrote down their strengths and weaknesses on paper, the U.S. rocks. And I'm sorry, they didn't mean to do that metaphor. But in any case, we've got the dollar, we've got a big market. We've got the better overall innovation ecosystem. We've got the commanding heights of semiconductors, commercial aircraft, pharmaceuticals, a lot of different areas. We rock. But in terms of who's got the momentum, who's got the psychological advantage where everyone thinks they're willing to go to the mat no matter what, they're willing to suffer more. And the Chinese certainly have that advantage right now. We look like we're wavering. We look like we are looking for a short-term deal and off-ramp, and that we won't go to the mat on this. And so that gives the Chinese, they've pulled open their coat. They've shown the weapons that they've got in that coat, and it scares the bejeebers out of others. And so I think even though on paper we look more powerful long-term, at the moment they have the advantage. So I think it all comes down to game day. How do you use the tools that you have, the players, the strategy? So right now, I don't think the U.S. is playing their hand very well. The Chinese are doing a better job. But because we have those advantages on paper, we could turn it around. We can adjust. We could do a much better job, and we could compete very effectively with the Chinese and manage this challenge. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, and we're going to have to continue to watch this and see what happens.
Scott, thank you for joining us. For our listeners, where can they follow along of your research, your studies, and your work?
Sure. Well, just about everything I publish comes out from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's CSIS.org. Occasionally, I publish some things in foreign policy and elsewhere, but I also have a podcast, not as exciting and as successful as yours, but it's called China Field Notes, and it's about introducing voices from China, either Chinese or foreigners who travel or do research in China, to an audience in the United States, because we need to understand how folks on the other side of the planet are looking at things, because their views are matter in what this competition looks like. And so I spend a lot of time traveling to China. My main research method is called jet lag, and I think it's important to introduce folks to those perspectives. So you can look at CSIS.org, and you can look out for China Field Notes.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.